David Beckham discovers that his maid lost everything in a flood and his reaction is impressive. It was an ordinary day in London, and the sky was overcast with a light drizzle falling steadily, as it so often did during the early spring months in the city. David Beckham had just finished an intense training session, and after such a demanding day, he was eager to relax in the comfort of his luxurious home. With his feet comfortably propped up on the plush sofa and a warm cup of tea in his hand, he sat back and allowed himself a moment of respite. As he casually scrolled through his phone, checking messages from friends, colleagues, and family, he noticed a sense of peace settling over him. He didn't mind the rain outside. In fact, he had grown quite accustomed to it over the years, especially given that he had spent much of his life in England. However, little did David know that this rainy evening would quickly take an unexpected turn and lead to a series of events that would change his life in ways he never anticipated. As David was reviewing a new set of training footage, his phone rang, interrupting his quiet evening. He glanced down at the screen, recognizing the name immediately. It was Mrs. Rose, his housekeeper, a woman who had been a steadfast and unwavering presence in his life for many years. Mrs. Rose had worked for the Beckham family since David was a young, ambitious footballer just beginning to make his mark on the world stage. Her voice, when she answered, was shaky, and David immediately picked up on the distress in her tone. "David, I'm so sorry to bother you at this hour, but something terrible has happened." Mrs. Rose's voice trembled with emotion, and David could feel the heaviness of her words. David's heart skipped a beat. "Mrs. Rose, what's wrong? What happened?" he asked, sitting up straighter on the couch, a sense of concern growing inside him. "The storm, it's destroyed my home. I've lost everything, David." "It's all gone," Mrs. Rose replied, her voice breaking with sorrow, and David felt a deep pang of sympathy as he processed her words. David sat in stunned silence for a moment, struggling to comprehend what he was hearing. Mrs. Rose lived in a modest neighborhood that, while not the most glamorous, had always been her sanctuary. He knew the home she had worked so hard for, filled with memories, was important to her. But hearing that a storm had wreaked such devastation left him speechless. Without wasting another moment, David grabbed his phone and immediately dialed her number again, his mind racing. When Mrs. Rose answered the phone, David's voice was filled with concern. "Mrs. Rose, are you okay? Are you safe? Can you tell me exactly what happened?" His words were soft but urgent, as he wanted to ensure she was out of harm's way. "I'm fine, David, but I don't know what to do. I've lost everything," she replied, the sorrow in her voice unmistakable, and David could hear the strain in her attempt to remain calm. David paused for a moment, his mind searching for the right words, but in that moment he realized words wouldn't be enough. It was time for action. "Listen to me, Mrs. Rose. You're coming here to my house. Don't worry about a thing. I'll take care of everything," David said firmly, his voice offering reassurance. He didn't hesitate for even a second. David immediately picked up the phone again, making a few quick calls to his security team to ensure that Mrs. Rose would be safely brought to his home. As he hung up the phone, he stood by the window, staring out at the persistent rain that dripped down the panes. His thoughts were with Mrs. Rose, and he felt a deep sense of responsibility for her well-being. Over the years, she had been more than just a housekeeper. She had become an integral part of his life, someone who had nurtured and cared for him and his family. She had been there when he needed support, and now it was his turn to help her in her time of need. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. David rushed to answer it, his heart racing in anticipation. He opened the door to find Mrs. Rose standing there, drenched from the rain. Her clothes clung to her and her face looked pale, streaked with tears. Her eyes were swollen, and despite her attempt to smile, the effort was strained. She was clearly exhausted, emotionally and physically, from the events of the past few hours. "David, I don't know how to thank you. You've already done so much by just offering to help," Mrs. Rose said, her voice trembling with gratitude and sadness. David didn't hesitate. He immediately opened his arms, pulling her into a warm and comforting embrace. "You don't need to say anything, Mrs. Rose. You're family to me. Come inside and get warm. Let me take care of you now," he said, his tone filled with sincerity. Inside, a hot meal was waiting for her, and a freshly brewed cup of tea had been prepared. But despite the comforting atmosphere, Mrs. Rose couldn't bring herself to eat. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she gazed down at them, still in disbelief that her life had been turned upside down. "I worked so hard to build a life for myself, David. I saved, I sacrificed, and now it's all gone. My bed, my things, everything I've worked for, it's all gone," she said quietly, her voice filled with sorrow and a deep sense of loss. David felt his heart ache for her as he watched her struggle to come to terms with the enormity of what had just happened. He knew how much Mrs. Rose had given of herself to support him and his family. She had selflessly cared for his children, cooked meals for them and kept their home in order. She had done so much over the years, and it was now time for him to do something for her that truly mattered. He stood up from the table, his eyes filled with determination, and walked over to her. "Mrs. Rose, this is your home now. You're staying here with me and my family, and I'm not taking no for an answer. You won't have to worry about anything. You've given so much of yourself to us, and now it's our turn to take care of you. No more stress. No more worries. You're not alone in this," David said, his voice firm yet compassionate. Mrs. Rose looked at him in disbelief, her eyes wide with shock. "David, no. I couldn't. I've worked for you all these years, but this is too much. I can't accept something like this," she replied, her voice hesitant and full of emotion. David gently placed his hand over hers, offering a comforting touch. "You've done more for us than you'll ever know. You're not just our housekeeper, Mrs. Rose. You're family to us and we take care of our family," he said with a soft smile. Tears welled up in Mrs. Rose's eyes, and she let out a sob, finally allowing herself to feel the relief that had been so long denied. "I don't know how to thank you, David. This means more to me than words could ever express. You've saved me," she said, her voice full of emotion. David smiled warmly at her, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. "You don't need to thank me. Just keep doing what you do best. Make us that delicious stew you always make. It's my favorite," he added with a chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. Mrs. Rose laughed through her tears, the sound bringing a sense of peace to her heart that she hadn't known in days. In that moment she knew that no matter what the future held, she would always have a place in David's home and in his heart. However, not everyone was pleased with David's decision to offer Mrs. Rose a place in his home. The following day rumors began to circulate among his inner circle. While some people praised David for his generosity and compassion, others raised their eyebrows and questioned his motives, suggesting that he might have an agenda. David's brother Sean came over to the house that morning for breakfast. As soon as he sat down at the kitchen table, he crossed his arms and gave David a pointed look. "So, Mrs. Rose is living here now?" Sean asked, his tone skeptical, his brow furrowed in concern. David glanced up from his coffee, sensing the tension in his brother's voice. "Is there a problem with that?" he asked calmly, but there was a firmness in his response. Sean sighed, taking a long sip of his coffee before replying. "Look, I know you've always had a soft spot for Mrs. Rose, but don't you think this is a bit much? The media is going to have a field day with this. People will talk, David, and I'm worried about how this could affect you," Sean said, his concern for his brother clear. David leaned back in his chair, his patience beginning to wear thin, but he kept his composure. "Sean, people are always going to talk. They'll say whatever they want no matter what I do. I'm not worried about that. What matters to me is that Mrs. Rose has been there for me and my family for years. She deserves more than just a paycheck. She deserves our support and care. I'm not going to turn my back on her," David replied firmly. Sean hesitated, clearly torn between his concern for the family's public image and his brother's decision. "I get it, David. I really do. I just worry about the public's perception. It could get messy," he said quietly. David nodded, understanding his brother's worry, but he wasn't about to change his mind. "I've faced my share of criticism in this life. If helping someone who has always been there for me is wrong, then so be it. But I know in my heart that it's the right thing to do," David said, his voice steady and resolute. Sean studied his brother for a long moment, clearly impressed by his conviction. With a sigh, he raised his glass and offered a small smile. "You're stubborn, but I respect your decision. Just, be careful, all right?" David smiled back. "Thanks, Sean. And don't worry, everything will be fine," he said confidently. As the days passed, the rumors continued to swirl around David's decision. Some people in the media questioned his motives, implying that he had ulterior reasons for offering Mrs. Rose a place to stay. But David wasn't swayed. He knew the truth and that was all that mattered to him. Then one evening as David was winding down at home, his phone rang once again. This time, the number was unfamiliar, and David hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" he asked, his voice cautious. "David Beckham," the voice on the other end said, calm but with an underlying sense of force. "You don't know me, but I think you should reconsider your decision to let Mrs. Rose stay with you." David's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this? And why are you calling me?" he asked, a sense of unease creeping into his voice. The man on the other end chuckled softly. Let's just say I know a few things about your situation. And it wouldn't be wise to make enemies with the wrong people, the voice said cryptically. David felt a chill run down his spine, but he refused to show fear. What do you want from me? He demanded. I just want you to think carefully about what you're doing. You've made a big mistake, David. Trust me, you don't want to go down this road, the man replied ominously before the call ended abruptly. David sat still for a moment, his mind racing. Who was this person? What did he know? And why was he so determined to interfere in David's decision? He knew this wasn't just a random call. The next day David took immediate action. He had his security team trace the call, and they uncovered something alarming. The man was somehow connected to a group that had been pressuring Mrs. Rose for years, extorting her over a debt she didn't even know she owed. The group had been relentless, and it seemed they were now trying to use David's generosity as leverage to intimidate him. David wasn't intimidated though. He arranged a meeting with the man to confront him face to face. If you ever come near Mrs. Rose again, you'll have to deal with me, David said coldly, his voice unwavering. The man, sensing the danger in David's words, quickly backed down. David knew that he had protected the people he loved and cared for, and that was all that mattered. When David returned home, he found Mrs. Rose sitting quietly in the garden, her face more peaceful than it had been in days. He walked over, sat beside her, and gently took her hand in his. It's all taken care of now, he said quietly, his voice reassuring. You can relax, Mrs. Rose. You're safe here, and I'll always make sure of that. Tears filled Mrs. Rose's eyes once again, but this time they were tears of gratitude, not sorrow. David, I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice full of emotion. You've done more for me than anyone ever has. David smiled softly, his heart full of warmth and gratitude. You've always been there for me, Mrs. Rose. Now it's my turn to take care of you. And in that moment, David knew that no matter what happened, the bond between him and Mrs. Rose would never be broken. They were family, bound together by love, gratitude, and a shared sense of loyalty that would withstand anything. And for David, that was all that mattered. Did you like this exciting story? So don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment below what you think of David's attitude. Have you ever lived or witnessed a story of gratitude and solidarity like this? Share in the comments for more inspiring stories like this. Activate the bell and stay tuned. Until next time.